Welcome. Thank you for watching this teaching video from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. Please check out our other videos and don't forget to like and subscribe. Our mission is to help people come to know Jesus better and love Him more every day. We believe this will not only help our own spiritual growth, but also help us better influence the community and the world for Christ. For more information about Oak Tree, please visit us at oaktreechurch.com. There you'll find past message series, online giving options, and more information about our discipleship process that we call The Path. Now enjoy this message. We'd love to hear from you in the comments or the website contact form. Thank you.
I told the guys out in the lobby that I'm going to be teaching from behind the drum shield this morning because our topic as we work our way through 1 Timothy is the ever popular women in ministry. So, yeah, happy birthday! Woo! That is it is our topic. This is one of the things that we like about working through books or large chunks of scripture is that sometimes you come across topics that you would otherwise like to avoid, like to do more in a conversational format, one-on-one when the question comes up. But I said that 1 Timothy is a very practical, very relevant book for today, not just for 2,000 years ago, 1,900 years ago when it was written. And we are going to be starting a section with the middle of chapter 2 today. There is a long section, multiple chapters. In fact, most of the rest of the book, I'll just put it that way. Most of the rest of 1 Timothy has Paul addressing specific groups within the church and giving encouragements and instructions and commands that the whole church is supposed to know about. Of course, the letter was to Timothy, and he was supposed to be leading the elders and overseeing this whole thing under Paul's authority. But there were certain things happening that were cultural, and some people like to focus on just the cultural stuff and say that doesn't have anything to do with today. But there are many, many things, and this is one of them, many things that are applicable, relevant, directly to the modern church in the 21st century, not just in the first century. And so we want to be careful that we don't take the Bible out of context, but we also want to be careful that we do apply something, even if it is not, a topic that we would prefer to focus on. And it's not that it's bad. It's not that it's bad. It's not even that it's necessarily hard. In fact, I don't think it's nearly as hard as a lot of people make it out to be. And I'm going to try to show you that this morning as we just work through the text, right? Taking it in context, letting it speak for itself, trying to not bring our own biases and stuff into it, theologies into it. We want the text to define our theology, not the other way around, right? Okay, we don't want to tell the Bible what it means. We want the Bible to tell us what it means. And this is a topic that I phrased it that way very specifically, women in ministry. We're not even going to start with the women, we're going to start with the men. But it doesn't matter because that verse gets overlooked because it's always about women in ministry. And frankly, one of the reasons I don't like talking about it is because it seems like, why should we have to talk about it, right? Aren't men and women both created in the image of God? Yes. Aren't we of equal value and equal worth to God? Yes. Aren't we saved by the same Jesus and empowered by the same Holy Spirit, and we both have spiritual gifts and everything? Yes. So why do some people make such a big deal about this? We'll see if we can figure that out today and over the next couple of weeks, actually. The other thing is that when I am asked this question, what do you think about women in ministry? Usually that's not the question. There's an underlying question. And the underlying question is, what do you think about women as pastors? That's the real question, the question behind the question. Okay? And we'll tackle that more next week. than this week. Because the answer to the question as stated, what do you think about women in ministry? My typical response is, I think it's super important, and I think women have great ministry, and the church could not do without women in ministry. Dun, dun, dun. And they're all like, you can't come here anymore. You just said that women could be pastors. Now, where in that statement did I say women could be pastors? You see, there's that question behind the question. There's the hidden question. And I think we have to distinguish those two questions. And that's why I'm spending a couple minutes here at the outset to make sure that we're handling this properly. Okay, we want to be very careful when handling the text. And frankly, again, it's not nearly as hard as some people make it out to be. It's not nearly as big of a deal. It's not nearly as difficult as some people make it out to be. There's about one verse. We're going to probably make it through in 1 Timothy chapter 2. My goal is to say verses 8 through 15, and that's just it. Just finish off the chapter. We started with chapter 2 last week, and we had people praying for government officials. Remember that? Praying for government officials because, as we scroll back to the beginning of the chapter, even for all those who are in authority, requests, prayers, intercessions, thanks for kings, all in authority, because we want to lead a peaceful and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. And that prayer is not just good, but it's actually acceptable and welcome to God. He wants to hear those prayers. He wants us to pray those things. Okay? And we worked our way through the rest of the passage and just sort of touched on verse 8. So I want the men in every place to pray. And that really brings us to this first thought, and that is, see, I did it again. Hold on a second. I keep doing this. That brings us to this first thought, that the therefore, in some Bibles, maybe yours says therefore in the beginning of verse 8 there. Some like mine say, so I want the men in every place, or therefore I want the men in every place to pray. What is the context of the prayer in verse 8? What should they be praying for? I'm not going to give you the answer. You have to work through it. What should they be praying for in verse 8? Yes. So what specifically, when it comes to prayer, precedes verse 8? Yes. Exactly. The things that God has already set up in verses 1 and 2, the requests, the prayers, the intercessions, and thanks be offered for all people, especially those who are kings and in government officials and all those in authority. So, therefore, I want the men to pray. Isn't that interesting? It's not that hard. We just have to look at the text and the context. There's a connection between these first 7 verses here are somewhat general. And then Paul is going to get specific to certain groups. And these groups, by the way, are going to be men in verse 8, women, just all believing men, women, believers, in verses 9 through 15, elders, we're going to get to the first half of chapter 3, deacons in the second half of chapter 3. There's going to be false teachers, and Timothy specifically, not as a false teacher, but as he fights false teachers in chapter 4. In chapter 5, we're going to talk about widows, those who are truly widows and in need in the church. In chapter 5, Paul is going to refocus attention on elders and how the church interacts with elders. In chapter 6, he's going to talk to rich people. We can just skip that chapter, right? He's going to talk to rich people, those who have wealth in this life, and what to do with that, and then he'll just wrap up. So for the rest of this letter, Paul is focusing on specific groups. Not that the rest of us don't need to hear it. In fact, the rest of us do need to hear how those groups are addressed so that we can interact with them, so that maybe we're going to be in that position one day. Okay, maybe not, doesn't really matter. So he's starting with men And so in verse 8, I want the men in every place to pray. Now, there are a couple of words that are translated men in the New Testament. One of them is very generic. It's just people. It doesn't matter. It's not men specifically. This one is men specifically. This one is not just people, but this is men, male. Sometimes the word is used for man. Sometimes it's used for husband. It is focused on the male gender. Okay? So group one, men. If you are of the male gender, the Apostle Paul said, I want you to pray. I want you in every place. And I think that's probably, maybe the little house groups throughout Ephesus. I would imagine it's everywhere. So we'll just go ahead and apply this to ourselves as well. In every place to pray, the same stuff he's already talked about, lifting up holy hands without anger or dispute. Now, this is interesting because this is the only time this word, this is one of only 8 times that this word for holy is used. It's not our normal word for holy. It's not the word that we typically think of when we think of God is holy and we should be holy and that sort of things. This is one, it's a much narrower definition. It has to do with a specifically devoted to God. Your translation, maybe if you have an older translation or a more formal Bible translation, it would say something like pious. It's not a word we use very often anymore, but pious, devoted, dedicated, consecrated, God-pleasing, something that really, really just makes God happy, really pleases God in his nature and in his character. These are the types of hands. Well, how do we get our hands? How do we get our hands to be pleasing to God? Well, that can be work, obviously. But I think it's bigger. The concept of holy hands, especially in the Psalms, is that hands reflect the heart. What our hands do is what comes out of our heart. And so a holy hand or holy hands, things that do things that are pleasing to God, comes from a heart that is pleasing to God. And if this is what Paul was thinking, then there's a good chance that holy hands refers to men who are in right fellowship with God. The 2 things that Paul says are required. Men, if you're going to pray effectively, first of all, you've got to be in right fellowship with God. Okay, doing the things that are God-pleasing, and I think this means coming from a heart that is God-pleasing. Secondly, he says, without anger or dispute. You know, it's hard to pray for somebody when you're angry with them. Well, there are certain prayers it's not hard to pray. We talked about last week in second hour, we talked about imprecatory prayers, right? Where David in the Psalms, for instance, is, God, kill my enemies. Those are easy prayers to pray when we're angry at somebody. And they're biblical, I guess, but I don't think that's exactly what Paul's talking about. Could be, I guess. Praying without anger. Praying without arguments. When we're arguing with someone, when we're angry with someone, you've experienced this as well, right? It's hard to pray for their salvation. It's hard if they're unbelievers. If they're believers, it's hard to pray for their spiritual growth. I mean, unless you say, God fix them, counts, that maybe that counts, okay? If we're praying for those in authority and government officials and that sort of thing, God fix this mess, is probably a legitimate prayer, right? But there should be not just a right fellowship with God, but it seems that public prayer, and I should say, I'll come back to this. Public prayer requires a right relationship with both God and people, not angry, not arguing with people. I said public prayer, and I forgot to mention this. This is actually going to be a big deal that helps set up our passage. And that is that this is not talking about private. This is not talking about at home. This is not talking about in your own prayer life, your Bible study life, whatever. The commands that Paul is going to give in these next several chapters, the commands, the instructions, the encouragements, all these things are related directly to the corporate worship service. Okay? This right here. All right, and that includes those of you who are online. You're part of this, the corporate worship service. When we have gathered to worship, and like I said earlier, worship in song, worship in prayer, worship in study, worship in saying hi to each other, all of that stuff is part of our worship and our gratitude to God. All of these commands and encouragements are within the context of the worship service. And that's going to play a big role in how we interpret this. Okay? So, public prayer, that's why I put public prayer on this, requires a right relationship with both God and people. Apparently, guys are easier because we get one verse and not 7. But 7 is the number of perfection, so do with that as you will. Okay? We come from verse 8 to verse 9, and Paul uses the word, and you'll find this in pretty much all of your translations, I think, the word likewise. How do I know he's shifting from one group to another? Because he's going to use this word likewise several times as he works through the next couple of chapters. Likewise this, which means, I think, that he's carrying through a general thought of right fellowship with God and right fellowship with people. No matter what else is going on, what other commands, what other instructions, what other encouragements, that sort of thing, that Paul is going to say to these other groups, the likewise, I think, keeps the overarching theme, right fellowship, right relationship with God, right relationship with each other. Okay? So we want to keep that in mind. Let me just read through this passage, and then we'll come back and tear this apart a little bit and see how we can apply this today. Likewise, the women, and again, this is not the generic word for people, it's women. Women, believers in the corporate gatherings, are to dress in suitable apparel with modesty and self-control. Their adornment must not be with braided hair and gold or pearls or expensive clothing, but with good deeds, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. A woman must learn quietly with all submissiveness, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. She must remain quiet. For Adam was formed first and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman, because she was fully deceived, fell into transgression. But she will be delivered through childbearing if she continues in faith and love and holiness with self-control. I don't know why anybody would think that this is a difficult section of Scripture, or that Paul would ever be charged with misogyny or anything like that, right? This is just so obvious. Oh man, I can't even say it. And I'm usually a fairly sarcastic person, and I still can't get that part out. Obviously, you might imagine that some people in the modern world would take issue with some of the things that we see in this passage, right? So do we let our culture just say, well, we're going to throw the Bible away? We're going to say, like Thomas Jefferson did, literally, there are certain things he didn't like in the Bible, so he took scissors or a little razor and he cut them out. The Jefferson Bible is famous for having holes in it because there are certain things, in his case, probably not about subjecting women, but he didn't believe in a resurrection, and so little sections about the resurrection were cut out, that sort of thing. Fun facts about Bible history. So what do we do with this? Well, I think we have to let the words speak for themselves, and so I'm going to have all sorts of slides for you on this one because there's lots of stuff to work through. So, likewise, 6 times in between 1 Timothy and Titus. Okay, 4 times we'll see it here in 1 Timothy if we were to go through Titus. And 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are a package, sort of. There's a lot of similarity, and that's why I bring that up every once in a while. Now, let's just work through this. Likewise, Women are to dress in suitable apparel. Okay? I just want to just tackle these words one at a time, and several of these words anyway, one at a time, and just look at these. All right. The word apparel here, this is the only time it shows up in the New Testament. Okay? So Paul is thinking of something very specific. This is not just sort of like this generic thing he talks about all the time. Oh, I'm just reminding you of this one more time. But there's something very specific that he wanted to bring across to the ladies. Don't forget, these are Christian women, ladies in Ephesus, that he says there's something going on that I want to address. In the ancient Greek, before Paul, before the church, before all this, it had an idea of restraint, of holding back, not restraint like, tight clothing, but holding, because it didn't have anything to do with clothing. It was just this concept of holding yourself back, sort of like self-control, restraining yourself from going too far in whatever the context was. When it did refer to clothing, it kept that idea of restraint, and so I like modesty shows up, but that's sort of, who defines what modesty is, right? It's one of those words that has changed its understanding and meaning to different people. But I really like, it's subjective, but I really like one dictionary used the phrase "not outlandish." I like that because number one, outlandish isn't a word that you use very often, and so it hasn't had a chance to change so much. Everybody, we may have a different picture of what outlandish means, but we all understand outlandish is way over the top, right? Way over the top. That's the whole point about outlandish, is that it's way over the top. Now, think about that in the concept of restraining oneself. Okay? When we gather, the purpose is not, or what one of the things, guys typically, this is not true with everybody, but typically are not using their clothing to be outlandish and to show off, right? Okay, ladies, sorry, sometimes you do. I've seen it, you've done it. Maybe you haven't, probably, but you've seen people who do it, where this is the way that some ladies present themselves, and it becomes outlandish. It becomes just like, I don't know, over the top, right? You've seen ladies who are wearing something, you're just like, wow, that could have been brought back a couple of notches and still be, right? Whether it's a big hat or it's a big dress or colors or whatever. The point is going to be explained. Don't park just on the one word. It can mean modesty, it can mean not outlandish, suitable. Well, that's the next key. What is suitable for church, right? Suitable or adorn, this concept of suitable apparel, not outlandish apparel, with modesty, self-control, whatever. Their adornment, now check this out. Adornment is a really cool word, or great word, I said, because it has the same root in Greek as cosmos. Now, we don't see this very often unless you intentionally go outside the city limits, go somewhere where there's not a lot of what they call light pollution, no city lights, no anything. You go somewhere where it's really, really dark. Have you done this before? You go somewhere where it's really, 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 really dark. There's no other lights, and you just look up in the sky. You ever done this? And just look at the beauty. Maybe some of you live far enough out that you can just do this. You just look up in the sky, and the beauty of the stars and the beauty of, you actually can see the constellations. You can see all of this stuff as you're looking out into the cosmos. Sometimes this word cosmos refers to the universe. Sometimes it refers to the world, the just our earth. But in this case, the same concept, really the base concept is not about the bigness, it's not about location, it's really about decoration. The concept is about decoration. How is the universe, when we look at the cosmos, Because there's other words for expanse, there's other words for sky, but when we look at the cosmos, what we're looking at is God's decoration. You know, we're in that time of year where people are decorating their houses, right? You got your Halloween decorations, and then you skip over Thanksgiving, move right to your Christmas decorations, right? And people have the lights, and they have the trees, and they have the stuff in the front yard and all this stuff because you want to show off you want it to look really, really, really neat and interesting. Right? You want it to be attractive to people driving by. In fact, there are entire neighborhoods that have contests, right? About how, maybe not outlandish, but how big they can decorate, how nice they can decorate. And you've maybe driven through neighborhoods before just looking at all the neat decorations, right? We do that. And there's nothing wrong with it. The fact that Paul used this word in this context, he's like, ladies, it's okay to decorate yourselves. We don't use that word typically, but to adorn yourselves. This is, cosmos is the same, it's the root word that we get cosmetic. It's the exact same, it's just the whole concept. The whole point behind cosmetics is what? To adorn yourself, to decorate yourself. Sometimes to hide flaws. Maybe you don't go out, but to hide things that you don't want to be seen. Maybe sometimes to be more attractive, or at least in our minds, right? Okay, that's what cosmetics are, to hide things, to bring out things, you know, all of that stuff, right? And Paul said, listen, he's not saying you can't have nice hair, you can't have gold, you can't have pearls, you can't have expensive clothing. He said, don't let that be your main decoration. Don't let just the outside stuff be what attracts you, or what attracts people to you. What attracts you, and especially, again, in the context of the worship service, don't be that person who is overly outlandish, using all the decorations to be that, and you end up being a distraction. Don't let that be the thing that makes you attractive. Not that that stuff is bad. There are entire denominations that say because of this, you cannot braid your hair, you cannot wear jewelry, you cannot do all that stuff. That's not what Paul's saying here. Their adornment, their cosmetic, their cosmos must not be with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothing, but with good deeds, as is proper for women who profess reverence for God. We have already seen in 1 Timothy that we are supposed to live in a certain way, and Paul's not going to let that go. Christians are supposed to live in a certain way. There is a right way to live. There is a wrong way to live for Christians. And you and I all know people who claim to be believers, who claim to know Christ as Savior, but if all you did was look at their life, you'd never guess it, right? You'd never guess it. Because their adornment is not in their lifestyle, it's what they've covered themselves with. Whether it's clothes or cosmetics or jobs or families or whatever. We hide who we really are with our cosmetics. And this is men and women both. With our adornments, right? And Paul says, listen, ladies, you tend to do this more than guys do. So apparently this has always been the case. Okay, Ephesus was a wealthy town. I'm sure there were wealthy women here, and they loved to show off. Okay, we've all seen it. All right, and he said, I don't have a problem with you having the stuff, but don't let that be the thing. When you gather together, don't let that be your adornment, your cosmetic. Don't let that be the thing that you think makes you attractive. Be a godly woman. Be a godly woman. That is actually more attractive. Verse 11. A woman must learn quietly with all submissiveness. Well, that doesn't get us into trouble at all, does it? Quietly with all. Paul gets a lot of pushback on this verse, by the way. This one, verses 11 and 12, and then people just skip over 15 altogether because they don't understand it. Okay? Remember that everything is going back. Let me scroll back here because this is important. The context. What we're praying for, what he wants the men to pray for, what he wants ladies to dress for. When we gather, we're trying to lead, verse 2, a peaceful and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. That's the context. Everything that Paul says, what are we praying for? A quiet life that we can live with all godliness and dignity. Why do we not want to dress outlandishly? Why do we want to make sure that we have some order in our worship services? Because the goal is to have a peaceful and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. Okay? Remember, that's what it's coming back to. So what he says has this context. So then, why are we dealing with learning quietly and that sort of thing? Well, here's why. The word to learn as a verb, to learn something, usually shows up as a noun in the New Testament, especially in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. And it's translated disciple. A disciple is a learner, somebody who is there intentionally, willfully wanting to learn. Now, if you have somebody who is there intentionally, willfully wanting to learn, are they allowed to ask questions? Yes. Are they allowed to make statements? Yes. Especially if feedback and questions are asked for, like I do a lot, right? Like that one. The ladies are just sitting there looking at me. I'm not sure if I should answer, Yes, ask the questions, you can answer questions, you can give feedback, all that sort of thing. What disrupts learning, not just for the one person, but for everybody, is when somebody who says that they're there to learn, and you've all experienced this, somebody says they're there to learn and they can't keep their trap shut, right? Men and women both. This is not a religious thing. This is not a church thing. This is just a people thing. Somebody is there. Maybe they go to a conference, they go to a seminar, and doesn't matter that they are not the ones being paid to speak, right? They are the know-it-all in the room. Right? You've had these people? You know these people? They always have a comment. They always have, well, that's not how I would have said it. Well, you didn't get paid the big bucks to be up here to say it, right? Well, I disagree with this. And they become a distraction to what's going on in the conference or the seminar or something. They're not really there to learn. They're there, somebody made them be there, whatever, right? They're there to show off, whatever. This is the context. When Paul says a woman must learn quietly with all submissiveness, don't be, and I think this probably was happening, this is why it comes up, this was probably happening in Ephesus, where there were people, men and women both, but apparently women were in the local church, in the congregation, in the worship service, and as things were being taught, they always had to have their say. Always had to have their say, right? And apparently they were the outlandish, they're dressing outlandish and all that. They were the loud ones, okay? They dressed loudly, they spoke loudly, they were just an overall disruption. And Paul says, listen, if you're there to learn, if you're there to study, if you're there to grow, do it quietly. Now, here's the other thing. The word quietly is really more of the result. The word itself can result in quietness, but I think possibly, silence or quietness or without disturbance is the broader meaning. When it's used elsewhere, it means without disturbance. Don't be a distraction. He's already said don't be a distraction with your clothing and everything. Now don't be a distraction during the teaching. Okay? quietly. Respectfully, I think, is probably in the context. Learn respectfully. Learn respectfully. Apparently, there was a real problem there. And again, this is not saying that men cannot be disrespectful, that men won't do this. But a lot of times women will do this more than men will, just because of our personalities. And we have to understand, and we can't be afraid of recognizing that men and women are different, right? We have different personalities, we have different traits, and these are things that apparently have been happening for 2,000 years of church history, and they do still happen today. Submissiveness, this concept of submissiveness, it is the willful placing of oneself under someone who is in authority. This is not demeaning. The word doesn't have any kind of inferiority or superiority built into it. Has nothing to do with that. Has nothing to do with worth. Has nothing to do with value. It has nothing to do with people are better than other people. It has to do with recognizing authority. That's all it is. When this word, this concept or this word of submit or submissiveness or subjection comes up, it has to do with recognizing authority. And I'll give you a perfect example. And that is when Jesus was, 12, 13 years old. Remember that Joseph and Mary took Jesus and they went to the temple in Jerusalem. And, when they took off, they thought he was with somebody else and found out that he wasn't with somebody else. And so after 3 days, they headed back to Jerusalem. And they found him in the temple, and he was having this great dialogue with the religious leaders. And they're like, where have you been? It's like, I haven't moved, And Luke tells us that Jesus submitted himself to his parents when they said, it's time to go home now. The one who just said, don't you know I'm supposed to be about my Father's business here in the temple? He submitted, exactly the same word. He submitted himself to his parents and went back home with them. Now let me ask you this. If this were a word about inferiority and superiority, about better value or worth more, who is superior? Jesus or Joseph and Mary? Every time. Not even a question. Not even a question. Okay, Jesus is God. And God is better than we are. If you have a problem with that, take it up with him. Okay? If this were a matter of inferior versus superior, Jesus wins all the time. That's not what it's about. This is about voluntarily, willingly, respectfully recognizing who has the authority at that moment. And at that moment, Jesus recognized his parents had the authority, and he said, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and he went home with them. Okay? Here, Paul says, listen, if you're here to learn, if you're here to study, don't be outlandish in your dress. Don't be loud in your talk. Don't be shouting over. Don't learn. Learn respectfully and learn willingly, voluntarily, recognize who the authority is here. Apparently, they were having problems recognizing who the authority was when they got together, and there were some women who were shouting out and they wanted to be in charge. And Paul said, that's not how it's supposed to work when we get together. Does this mean that a woman is not allowed to speak at all in a worship service? No, of course not. Of course not. We could go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and it's possible that Paul wrote 1 Timothy from Corinth. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he talks about women who are praying in the congregation, in the worship service. Women who are prophesying in the worship service. This one verse does not negate everything else that he says. It just builds on it. It just builds on it. Verse 12, he says, listen, I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. There is a level, there is a hierarchy in the home, there is a hierarchy in the church, and when it comes to teaching doctrine, when it comes to the actual authority, how God sees, remember, God is not a God of chaos and disorder, but a God of order. And there should be a hierarchy in the home. It goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 2, when God told humanity, don't eat the fruit off of this tree, all of humanity was wrapped up in one guy. There was Adam. Eve had not been created yet when God said, don't eat the fruit off of this tree. How is Eve supposed to find out? How are the children supposed to find out, don't eat the fruit off of this tree? It's Adam's job. It's Adam's job. So literally from page 2 of the book, it's been the man's job to teach his family sound doctrine, healthy doctrine, how to get to know God better, to know Him better and love Him more, like we say. It's always been that way. And that's not a result of sin. This was before sin. This is not a result of the curse. This is before sin. It's always been this way. God has always set it up that way. Again, it has nothing to do with value or worth or inferiority and superiority. It has everything to do with God says, I have a structure and I want this structure to be followed. That's it. And the church, the congregation, is supposed to be a family of families, right? And so if there's a specific hierarchy or structure or order in the family, what we're going to see is that carries over to the family of families. Makes sense, doesn't it? When you just let this text speak for itself, it makes sense. Why would the church have a different structure, a different order when we've come together than what God has already told us to do at home? It carries over. And so he says, listen, I don't allow a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. She must remain quiet. And again, in this context, you have to have in this context. These two things, during these sections, she is to remain quiet and not disturb the lesson. Again, does that mean you can't ask questions? Of course not. You can't respond to questions and feedback when it's asked? Of course not. Okay? The context is about living in godliness and dignity. So dignity, not disruption, is the key here. Then he says, here's how I know it's not cultural. Let me just put it this way. Here's how I know. In fact, I'm going to put it up there in big orange letters. This is not cultural. Okay? This is not. Here's how I know. Because Paul goes back in verses 13 and 14 to creation and the fall. Long before Israel, long before the church, long before anything. Verse 13, for Adam was formed first and then Eve. That's part of the structure. God designed it that way. But here's why it has to do with teaching. Adam was not deceived, but the woman, being fully deceived, fell into transgression. Here's the thing. This is a general statement. I know this is not true with everybody, but that's just that's what happens with general principles all the way through. Ladies, you tend to be more trusting than guys are in a lot of areas. It's just the way it is. Ladies tend to be more trusting than men are in a lot of areas, and that is also true in religion and in doctrine and everything. We're going to see over here when we get to chapter 5, Paul would bring it back up again in 2 Timothy chapter 3, that there is a whole satanic industry, if I can use that term. There is a whole satanic industry built on deceiving women. You know that? And it starts all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve were standing there looking at the tree, discussing why they wanted it or whatever their discussion was. And when the enemy came by, who did he talk to? The woman. How do I know that Adam was there? Because just a few verses later, when she took the fruit, she ate it, her eyes were opened, and she gave to her husband who was with her. Saw the whole thing, heard the whole thing. The enemy decided, I'm not going to talk to him, I'm going to talk to her. Literally from Genesis chapter 3, there is a satanic industry around deceiving women. And Paul says that is one of the reasons It's not because you're worth less. It's not because you're inferior. It has nothing to do with your value. It has everything to do with the fact that in the local church, in the home and in the local church, God has designed for men to be the teachers. Okay? Is this saying that men can't be deceived? Of course not. Of course not. In fact, Adam was with her, heard the whole thing, saw the whole thing, decided he was going to do it, and he wasn't deceived, in fact. Okay? He did it knowingly, willfully, intentionally. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway. Is that better? No. No, of course not. But there is an all-out attack in this world more against women than there is against men. And it's satanic, it's demonic, and especially when it comes to matters of sound doctrine, healthy doctrine, false doctrine, there is a bigger, ladies, you just need to know this, there is a full-scale assault that comes through the media, and it comes through books. This is why it's so careful, our ladies' Bible study, the books that you read, the things that you listen to. There is a full-scale assault, women, against you from Satan himself. And it started on page 3. And he's never let up. And Paul says, listen, when we gather as a church, ladies, nothing personal, but I don't want you to be the teachers. God has said the men should be the teachers from the very beginning, and we're going to continue to hold that. Okay? Verse 15. I say it's pretty simple. I think we can do it quickly. Here's going to be the problem. If you have a different translation than I do, you're going to have, there's two things. But she and if she. But she in verse 15 and if she in verse 15. Now, some of you know that I travel with Word of Life, and I teach at some of their Bible institutes, and I teach Bible and different books of the Bible. Some of you know that in addition, there are 3 other schools that I work with online. They're online schools, and one of my I teach their Bible colleges, seminaries, and I teach at the undergraduate level, bachelor. I teach master's students, and I teach doctoral students, and one of the main classes that I teach is Greek. Okay? It's fun. I know you can't understand it. You can't imagine why it would be fun, but it really is. I got it. Okay, no problem. Make all the fun of me you want. That's fine. The only reason I don't make a big deal about it, the only reason I bring this out is because I think I know something. I think I know something. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been teaching Greek for 12 years or so. I think I know a little something. And yet, I've never been invited to be on a Bible translation team. I've never been invited to be on a committee that makes these English Bibles that we have. And those are some really, 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 really smart people. And so when I stand here and I say, well, this is what I think it means, I understand I'm saying this, yeah, I've got some experience, I've got some what I think is some knowledge, but these are some really, 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 really smart people. So I try to do this with at least an ounce of humility that could be I'm wrong. Right? But this is one where I don't think I'm wrong. And the way that I back up the fact that I don't think I'm wrong is that it's really easy Greek, and even our English Bibles can't agree on how this is supposed to be translated. So pick one, and I'm going to tell you which one I pick, and then you can make your own decision. Okay? Read commentaries, read your study Bibles. Let's talk about this in second hour. But here's what happens. We have to understand that the context is Genesis chapter 3, not just 1 Timothy chapter 2. When we read verse 15, he has just spent 2 verses talking about Adam and Eve, Adam and Eve. So in verse 15, he's still, I believe, drawing from Adam and Eve. And it's possible that if you have a different Bible than I have, a different English Bible, yours will not say in verse 15, but she, and then if she. Yours might say women at the beginning, which is plural, not singular. It could be they, which is plural, not singular. And then if they, which is plural, not singular, or if she, whatever. Here's why I make this point. Because based on the Greek texts that I've looked at, the first she, or the first pronoun there, the she in verse 15, Paul wrote it singular, she, just like we have there. The second one is plural, they, which means that I'm going to disagree here with the net translation, and I'm going to agree with, actually, the ESV is not my favorite Bible, but the ESV gets it right as far as in my reading. Singular in the first one, plural in the second one. Here's why this matters. Because Adam was not deceived, but the woman, because she was fully deceived, falling into transgression, but she will be delivered. Who is the she? If you just do a plain natural reading of the text, who is the first she? Has to be Eve. She's the closest referent. In order to get it back to the other Christian women, you have to skip way over Eve and you have to go back 3 verses. Okay? She will be delivered through childbearing. What do we know about Eve and childbearing? You go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, and there is a conflict that God says because of sin, you're going to have increased labor. It's going to be hard, increased labor and pain in your childbearing, and you're going to have this conflict between you and your husband. At least husbands and wives, if not men and women, are going to do this naturally. And women are going to want to rule, but men will dominate if they don't choose passivity like Adam did. Men tend to go in one of 2 directions, right? They're either completely laid back and won't do anything, or they're way over the top and they dominate. And that can become abusive, of course, right? And without God, without Christ, this turns into women, you want to get your way, what do you have to do? Nag, manipulate, withhold, whatever, right? So what do men do? They either just sit back and do nothing passively like Adam did, or they dominate and abuse. Those are our 2 options in a godless, undignified life. Except what Paul is talking about is learning how to live a godly, dignified life. It doesn't have to be that way. She, Eve, will be delivered through childbearing as more and more and more women are born and choose to live a godly, dignified life. Respectful, learning, growth, knowing Him better, loving Him more, the whole thing. If they, and here's why I don't like where the net is, because for whatever reason they don't translate this plural, the ESV and others do, if they continue. How is Eve's curse and consequence offset? How does she get delivered, if you can put it that way? Ladies, by you living the way God wants you to live. How do we not have this if both men and women live in godliness and dignified lifestyle? But it takes both. No manipulation, no abuse. No dominion, no passivity, no nagging. It doesn't have to look like Genesis 3. It can actually look like 1 Timothy 2. And she, Eve, in a sense, can be delivered or rescued from that curse that she brought on herself and Adam brought on himself. Ladies, if you come to know Him better, love Him more, live a dignified, godly lifestyle, continuing in faith and love and holiness and self-control. So, I don't think it's that hard. If you just read the words on the page, allow for little things, look at multiple translations, see how did different really, really smart people put all this together or understand this. So here's how I just want to wrap up with the application, and then we'll take a break, and I know we're a little bit long this morning, go into second hour. Here's the applications that I want to think about. Men and women. Since we address two groups, we'll just address two groups. Men. Are we right with God and the world around us? Are we in right fellowship with God and the world around us? Are our prayers being heard? By the way, we can talk about it more in second hour if you want, but 1 Peter chapter 3 says that your prayers will be hindered if you're not treating your wives correctly. Isn't that interesting? Men, if you don't treat your wife properly, God won't even listen to you. Are your prayers being heard? Are you right with God and the world around you? Are you praying for our government, for our officials, for our church, for your family? Men, women, ladies? Are you living in such a way that is both God-honoring and attractive to others? Not outlandish, not loud, not overbearing, but godliness and love and holiness and good deeds and all of these things that he lists here in 1 Timothy 2. Are you willingly, voluntarily learning? I know you are. You're here. And that's what you've chosen to do this. Are you learning from those who God has placed in authority over you, whether it's in this church or in your home, submitting yourself to the God-ordained structure so that when you go out and you're in the world, people look at you and it's not because of all the external stuff, but it's really the true beauty that shines through. And people say, that's really neat. I'm attracted to who you are, not just what you look like, right? And there's a big difference there. We can help bring people to Christ.